What did you call it? Where the people came from, the divorcees?
Albro Lake.
Albro Lake.
We had boundaries that you weren't allowed to go over. You weren't allowed to go over.
So this was in an area in Dartmouth.
Well, where we lived, of course. You weren't allowed to go over Woodlawn Avenue. And you weren't allowed to go over Victoria Road. And you weren't allowed to go past Cherry Drive. And whatever, I can't remember the name of the street. No, it would be to Woodlawn Avenue. Those were the unspoken parameters. You learned the hard way if you went over them. You knew, but you had to try it. You had to push it just to see what you get, right? You couldn't hear the bell, like we talked about before. And then that was already, you were far away enough you couldn't hear the bell. They knew Mrs. Stanford did ring the bell and you didn't come within the proper time, right? So those are unwritten rules, who you could play with, who you were friends with, and you had to come report back who you're playing with today, right? And if you lied, they figured out, they knew, right? Because then that kid would come and knock on the door and say, oh, who's that? You didn't tell me you're playing with him. And my mother had to check them out because she knew bad influences and what they did. No way. And then you were saying, no, he's not good enough. You can't play with him. And then you go, oh, yeah, no, too bad. No, I've spoken. End of story. Done.
So your mother, yeah, you've mentioned that in previous stories that your mother was very. Well,
when I think about it, my cousin, when I visited British Columbia, was a negative influence, and I did things with him that I wouldn't have done with anybody else because my mother knew, but she couldn't restrict that with him. We broke into school. We did all kinds of stuff, right? We set a stump on fire in Abbotsford. We did lots of stuff. My cousin had a little game where he pretended to be a gang leader, right? And the guys were going to come to kill him that night. I believed every word of it, and I stood outside the house and just screaming my head off to bloody murder. And all the women, my aunt and my uncle, they all come, what's the matter? They're going to kill Gary. They're going to kill Gary. And then Gary had to come like a little bad boy with his tail between his legs, and then he had to tell them the big story that he created, right? And he couldn't believe that I was so stupid and so naive that I'd be sucked in by the story. He just couldn't help himself, right? This was fresh meat, boy. And he paid.
This Eastern kid.
Oh, this Eastern.
This Nova Scotia boy was.
Yeah, listen to his mother. What the hell was this? So that was a very bad influence, and I did things with him, right? That it would never have happened at home, ever, because mother would know. And she was suspicious of a lot of this, right?
She knew kids.
Yeah, well, but I think most did. But my aunt, Auntie Gladys, she ignored all that kind of stuff about her children. They were orangutans, as my dad called them. They were orangutans, and we would sit at the table, and they would behave so bad that one day my dad got up in the middle of a visit and said, that's it, I've had enough, Gene, we're going to the hotel. And he gathered us up, and he was off to the hotel. And my aunt just freaked out. Well, what's going on? And they're behaving so bad. They don't know any table manners. They don't know how to behave properly. They're squabbling amongst each other, and we don't do that. And so we're out of here. And everything changed after that, including them. My cousins were both really embarrassed that it came to that. They didn't do that. They loved my father, and he never said a word till that happened, right? He couldn't take it anymore. So that's how much, for my dad, culture and etiquette was how you wore it. And those who knew my mother, the kid next door, Eddie Porter, and his dad was the first one I saw, a 57 Cadillac, beautiful dark blue 57 with a light blue roof. And he was a real estate agent, but they lived in the apartment. People who lived in apartments, they were questionable. They weren't real people. Obviously they had problems, or they wouldn't be in an apartment, they would own a home. And so Eddie Porter's dad was into real estate, and the word was there was must have been some shystering going on, that he wasn't an ethical man, and that Eddie Porter would come over to the house to visit with me. And then I watched this 10-year-old kid handle my mother. And my mother knew exactly what he was up to. My mother was criticized and said, well, what are you doing this and that? He looked at her right in the eye and he said, God, you look good in that dress, Gene. Gee. And my mother looked at him and went, wow, he's good. He's good. Like he knew. He tried to deplane her. Yeah. He knew exactly what he was handling with. So then my mother's assessment of who Eddie Porter was, and he was a manipulator, and you had to really watch him. You did not want your son around that. That was going to go down a bad road. And that was the end of it. Never saw Eddie Porter again. Saw the Cadillac, though, every day. That was worthwhile. They eventually, he moved away, right?